Hi, I'm Addison K. Witt, Poet Laureate of the Defense of Democracy and host of this podcast. The attack on America's public school system isn't slowing down, but neither are we. Here you'll meet authors, educators, students, and defenders from across the country who aren't just sounding the alarm, they're answering it. You'll be informed, you'll be moved, and if we've done our job right, you'll be ready to stand with us. This is the Defense of Democracy podcast. Let's get into it. America. You know, it's always been a story in progress. It's a nation shaped not only by laws and elections, but by the voices, faith, struggles, and dreams of the people fighting to belong within it. Way too often we reduce American history into simple narratives. But the truth is far more layered, more human, more complicated, and perhaps even more beautiful. Today's conversation explores a question that sits at the very heart of democracy itself. Who gets included in the story of America? I'm Addison Witt, host of Rise, a Defense of Democracy podcast, and today I'm honored to welcome filmmaker Jack Gordon, director of the powerful docuseries Undivided. Jack, welcome to Rise, the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, it is, again, my pleasure. You are part of what we call our advocacy spotlight, because this is a part of the film festival, Defense of Democracy Film Festival, and this is the first time we've actually had a series. So it's been really interesting to go on this journey. Before we get too far into it, why don't you tell us more about yourself, your work, and how did you come to this project, Undivided?
Sure. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I've been a filmmaker for the last 21 years. I started out in college and where I was at film school, started becoming interested in documentaries and specifically in advocacy work. So my cousins and I started a family business of a production company that was focused primarily on international advocacy and working with international organizations that are doing work in public health and environmental conservation, economic development projects. We started that company overseas in Madagascar, of all places.
Wow.
And have since built a great team that is on 4 continents. We operate with a full-time staff in Madagascar, in Colombia, in Spain, and in the United States. And these folks are working day in and day out as talented, amazing filmmakers that have done work that spans the globe. Collectively as a team, we've either produced or run projects in over 90 countries. And a lot of that work continues to be in the advocacy space, as well as working on feature documentaries that have been broadcast on major platforms like HBO and ESPN and Apple. And this is Undivided is our first piece of original IP. So it's a very exciting project to be working on, to bring it to life at a time when, as you noted, it's very critical for us to be reflecting on issues of democracy and belonging and pluralism here in the United States.
So I'm talking to a big-time international director.
Not quite big time, but have enjoyed the opportunity to travel far and wide, and I'm grateful for that throughout my lifetime.
Well, it really is an honor to have you here, and the piece, I think, speaks. I know it does. It speaks to me in very personal ways, because I grew up in Texas, the Bible Belt, very religious communities, and from the very beginning, I was fascinated by religion. And I think in part it's because many of my great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents founded religious organizations in our greater community. And because my great-great-grandfather had 14 children on my maternal side, and on the paternal side, they had 12 children, I was related to everyone. And many of those, the children or siblings, were founders of different types of religious organizations, whether it was Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal,
Hmm.
and so forth and so on. So as a child, I went to many different denominations and continued that throughout my life, even Jehovah's Witness, Mormon.
Hmm.
Every time someone invited me to go to their organization or their religious service, I said, okay. And I would go and stay for 5 to 6 months, actually, sometimes
Wow.
longer, and began seeing a through line in all religions, and felt very connected to that. So it's a practice I've maintained throughout my life. So this was really interesting to me.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a beautiful way to have gone about exploring different religious groups, and I would wish that everybody would have that same openness.
that's why I think I enjoyed the journey here so much. You start off in, I believe, or at least the first episode
Hmm.
I saw begins in South Carolina,
Mm.
and there was a lot of talk about uh, the indigenous people there and the ancestry and the water
Hmm.
and how that was connected to the nature, but you can also transfer nature to Jesus or what other symbols that represent your faith.
Yeah, it was a great exploration, particularly of the history of the Black Church in South Carolina, how it really came out of a movement for abolition and liberation of Black people who at the time were going through the experience of slavery. And under those harsh conditions, um, were staying connected to that spiritual strength that would get them through that horrible experience. For some of the population that were introduced to Christianity, there was an adherence to this new faith that they were introduced to, and I think that your family experience is similar to the experience of folks that were there, that they created churches and were advocating for themselves, often because these churches were segregated and there was a limit
Yeah.
to the role that Black people could have within the white, for example, Methodist church that was prevalent in the area. And so, with that movement for liberation, folks separated and created the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME, which continues to be a very strong church within Black communities.
Yes.
And at the same time, there were people for whom they didn't let go of their traditional African beliefs and rituals,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
or integrated them into Christian spirituality and practice. And so in South Carolina, as in other parts of the country, you have this really powerful expression of both traditional beliefs, which are colloquially called hoodoo or
Yes.
conjure,
Yes.
and a Christian identity. And part of our episode explores the tension between those and how particularly young people are resolving their Christian identity with hoodoo practice and moving beyond what might have been at some points a painful experience with Christianity, and creating this new space in which they aren't abandoning the traditions of their families, but they're also reclaiming the past traditions and rituals of their ancestors, as you said, as a way to connect further with the natural world and this, greater sense of liberation and connection to the universe.
I think that is such an interesting note because when we look around the country, certainly here in America, we've seen religion change. We've seen the way people practice their religion changing tremendously. And
Mm.
and I find that very interesting in there's a reclaiming, as you said, of the past
Right.
and what religion, practice and spirituality means now to the individual,
Right.
And then there, of course, there is the traditional that is still holding on to their beliefs and the way that they practice as well. But I was just at a church recently, a Baptist church here in Dallas, who talked about being kicked out of several of the major organizations that oversee their
Mm.
denomination because their belief systems are changing, or at least the way they practice their beliefs are changing. For instance, there was a church that said they um, welcome and are marrying same-sex people, and it is a
Hmm.
traditional Baptist church, was in part of the Southern Baptist religion, but
Right.
they were asked to leave, and they joined another organization, and they were asked to leave.
Right.
And yet there are a lot of people that are coming to that church, whereas we see many churches that are practically empty. So when you were traveling around the country and seeing and listening to people, were you also noticing this friction between the old and the new and the transformation that's happening?
Yeah, so this is a five-part series. Undivided looks at five different uh, communities, different religious minorities, and the role that they've played in American history, the struggles that they've faced, the way they've overcome them, and the ways that they're continuing today to work through some of the longer-standing issues of um, of persecution, of misunderstanding, of intolerance, and really comes back to this question that you articulated at the beginning of belonging within the U.S. and who's invited to belong. So throughout the series, we visit not just Black churches and hoodoo practitioners from the Gullah Geechee community in South Carolina. We also visit Jewish communities in New York and Rhode Island. We
Mhm.
visit Latter-day Saints communities in Utah, and we visit Sikh communities in um, the California Central Valley, as well as Muslim communities in New York. And in each of these stories, actually, you can see this through line. And this was frankly the reason why we created the series. When you start to explore this history of what on the surface might seem very distinct and disconnected religious communities, actually understand that the experience of one echoes the spirit, the experience of another. It may not have happened at exactly the same time and place, but particularly for those immigrant communities, there is a commonality. So, for example, the tension around assimilation, how much of their religious practice and distinct articles of faith, or maintaining what might be viewed as a a separate way of operating in mainstream modern society, was something that was expressed both in Hasidic Orthodox communities that we talked to in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, New York, as well as with young Sikhs who grew up in farming and agricultural communities in California's Central Valley. That the idea of maintaining a distinct way of life, in the case of Sikhs, their articles of faith include wearing a turban, and for men, maintaining an unshorn beard.
Hmm.
Um, and these make them distinct from who we would normally perhaps interact with in the majority population, and also make those communities targets. They might be misidentified because of the ignorance of people. Obviously, this is something that we've encountered through history, where when Sikh immigrants started coming here at the early 1900s, they were called Hindu, or in some cases Mohammedans, which was
Right.
the term for Muslim at the time. And then even in a post 9/11 world, actually the first person that was killed in a hate crime after 9/11 was a Sikh man, because the perpetrator of that crime, that murderer, misidentified him as a
Uh,
Muslim.
and
So
therefore terrorists.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas the Punjabi Sikh community had nothing to do with the acts on 9/11. Obviously, the majority of the Muslim community had nothing to do with the acts of 9/11. This was a an act of terrorism by a particularly extremist group, but nevertheless, part of what we need in our country is a better, you could say, religious literacy, baseline religious literacy, which is different than studying the text of a religion like you would in a seminary. Um, we're not talking about going deep into um, an academic study of the Bible, for example, but we're talking about being familiar, having a baseline starting point of the practices and cultural aspects of religious communities in our society, so that we have a better understanding of, when we encounter someone from that tradition, why they may act in a certain way, why they may be, for example, looking to take certain days off from school or work, why they dress in a certain fashion, and hopefully that in the way that we see that Judeo-Christian ideas are really at work in our greater society in a way that we almost never question it, right? Why do we
Yeah,
have Christmas off? Well, it's because the majority of people, observe Christmas,
right.
but that's not the case for Eid al-Fitr, which is a Muslim holiday. It's not the case for Vaisakhi, which is a Sikh holiday. And if we had better understood the meaning of these traditions and these aspects of each other's practices, then I think that we would have a better sense of tolerance, and frankly, we would see ourselves reflected in the themes and philosophies of those practices.
I agree. Jehovah's Witness is another organization that doesn't practice Christmas or other holidays.
Sure.
And you just reminded me of something. So I go to a Presbyterian church here in Dallas, Texas, and they're part
Okay.
of a community called Sacred Spaces. And that is where many different religions congregate once a month. The Jewish community, Muslim community. I was just at one recently at the Baptist church I referenced earlier, and the Baptist preacher who was there, the minister there, gave the oral history of the Baptist community born out of the Jewish religion and
Hmm.
faith. And that was fascinating because there were people in the room who were Jewish here from Dallas, Texas. And when he asked, "Are there any questions?" it was so interesting to see people raising their hand and asking a lot of questions, right? So this community here in Dallas of people, and I don't know if it's a larger community that's spreading around the country, but certainly here in Dallas, it really has been interesting. So they go to each of their established um, structures, and we'll have a meal together and an open
Right.
conversation dialogue to talk about their own faith and a lot of what you just pointed out. Why do you do this? Why is this your practice?
Hmm.
And it establishes not only goodwill but the education, the understanding that you were talking about. What surprised you most during the filming of this series?
Yeah, so as you said, I think that when we start to open our doors for our community centers, our churches, and so forth, and invite others in to talk about their traditions with a posture of learning, that we can find that there's lots of beauty to be found in each other's tradition, and a way that we can be stronger as a community when we understand each other better. Um, that boldness, I think, is really a necessary part of how we operate in the United States today, because lots of people are even um, that even sort of stop or censor themselves for fear of being embarrassed, or asking the wrong question, or asking it in the wrong way. Whereas I think if we communicated in a way that was um, that communicated a real desire to learn, that we would find that folks are very willing to answer our questions patiently, because they're excited that somebody takes an interest. I'm a member of the Baha'i community, and
Mm-hmm.
whenever anybody asks me a question about the Baha'i tradition, Baha'i beliefs, I'm very happy to share them, because it is a very small religious minority within the United States. And I think that there's a lot that this community offers in terms of teaching and continue to progress as a society. So part of what we did was really to go around and ask questions that people otherwise might be afraid to ask, because they seem like sensitive subjects. One example of that is going to visit the Latter-day Saints and ask about their history of persecution. Folks may
That was
think that,
very interesting. That was in
yeah,
Utah, right?
that's right. It was in Salt Lake City, and we visited with a handful of different, very different LDS communities that are united in their participation in the church, and yet have very different points of view on how they might practice, or how they've been culturally accepted or not. So, we first talked with historians and some community members who were reflecting on this period of persecution that the Latter-day Saints faced in the mid 1800s, as they were driven from the east of the United States out west. They were seen as a real threat to the United States from a
Mm-hmm.
governmental and political point of view, because they were quite radical in their thinking. Lots of people know about the polygamy that was
Right.
part of the Mormon experience during that time, but actually they don't know that there was an abolitionist strain through the Latter-day Saints organization of community life as well. That there were Black people that were accepted into the church from its earliest days, and were given the priesthood. Now, the thing that people do know is that the priesthood was actually taken away, and really the reason for that was as much a political decision as it was perhaps a religious uh, doctrine, and that was put down by Brigham Young when
Mhm.
the territory of Utah was becoming established, as a way to pacify these two different groups that were coming from the east, from the northeast, where there was more of an anti-slavery movement, and from the south, with slave owners and their enslaved that came to Utah. Both of these groups were part of the Latter-day Saints Church, and they were seeking refuge from the persecution that Mormons were facing at the time. And yet there was a internal struggle within the community of what would this territory be? Would it be a free state, or would it be a state that allowed slavery to happen? And for Brigham Young, who was the leader of the church at the time, to pass down this revelation, as he claimed it,
Right.
that Black people, and specifically Black men, would not be able to receive the priesthood. um, this was something that was a way of finding some sort of middle ground between these two opposing groups, and it was not something that was taken lightly. We talked about Orson Pratt, who was a legislator at the time, who really pushed back against this, and he was not the only one. But ultimately, the church decided that in this, racist policy that held for over 100 years, until the mid 70s, when President Spencer Kimball undid that and revealed a new revelation. You could say that allowed Black men to have the priesthood. So we talked to Black Mormons about that history. We said, how is it that you are part of the church in spite of this racist path and it passed? And part of what they told us was about how they continue to struggle as a cultural minority within the LDS Church, with a lot of the same racist and anti-Black issues that we face in the broader society. even within their church communities, and yet they are very forcefully adamant about holding the line and being there for one another, and encouraging their LDS brothers and sisters to to recognize and be more affirming in the role that Black people have in the church, as opposed to being dismissive of it.
Wow, uh, that seems to be a consistent theme within religions at large, particularly here in America. And I
Mm-hmm.
noticed that in because when you were in Utah, you also uh, surround what his name is Simran.
Simranjeet Singh is the host of our show.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he was in the, I think, LGBTQ community and talked about Utah and didn't realize that it was so, I think, maybe prevalent or such a large part of the larger community. And I think the woman said that he was talking to pockets of it are. But she is part of the church, and that community is part of the church. And I noticed throughout that, and even in my own experience, there's been so much pain born into or out of religion, and people have persevered and
Right.
continued to uphold the tenets and beliefs and faiths in spite of their personal pain and persecution. And I'm wondering what stories affected you emotionally and what surprised you most about filming these stories.
Yeah, well, I think the story that you pointed to about the LGBTQ community within the LDS Church is one of those surprising aspects of what we found. And as you said, the conversation that Simran, our host, had with some members of the community uh, illuminated this idea that in some ways it's a continuation of the line of thinking that did marginalize Black people in the previous century.
Mm-hmm.
That queer Muslim, or excuse me, queer Latter Day Saints are not necessarily welcomed with open arms. Now, in some cases, they are on an individual basis, and part of what we encountered was this idea of bishop roulette, which is that the bishop of your particular community, called a ward in LDS parlance, who serves a particular term as the leader of that community. If that person is queer affirming, then even if you're engaging in gay marriage or with a partner or something like that, or you're out simply out as a queer person within the community, they're welcoming, and they may not necessarily push the issue. But as soon as that bishop is transferred out, or their period of service is finished and someone else comes in, if that person has more of a anti-gay perspective, they may make things a lot more difficult for you, and doing something like taking away your temple ordinance, which is basically permission to go enter the temple, which is sort of a key part of LDS practice, to go and say prayers and to be able to engage in certain ritual practices in the temple. So it's a big deal that goes beyond just some of the big banner issues of as we see in the headlines, the LDS Church advocating for 20 years ago, Prop 8 not passing in California, so that which restricted gay marriage. That's kind of the impression that people believe politically, and certainly I think this story is more complicated than that. because they have struggled with what are the official policies of the church. And the person that we spoke with, who you referred to earlier, Kate Mower, who is a non-binary LDS member, they talked about how confusing it is living as a trans person or as a gay person in the church, because you never really know how to negotiate your space within the community. Are you going to be accepted for now? Are certain rights going to be taken away? Certain privileges going to be taken away? Or is it simply going to be an uncomfortable experience if maybe you move communities and you're not sure how you're going to be accepted in the new community that you move into? And yet, these are members of the church that are really, this is one of the questions that Simran put to them, and is probably a question that a lot of people have. Why do these individuals, in spite of this, stay in the church?
There. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Why would they stay there? That's a core question, one that maybe people who are outside of the experience of being in the Latter-day Saints community, like myself, don't understand. We don't know what that experience is like, and yet that is part of the ineffable mystery of faith, that if someone is called to a particular tradition, and in this case, maybe they grew up in the tradition and that's part of their family heritage and legacy, it's not so easy to just drop it. Now, a lot of people have had a lot of traumatic experiences, and maybe they've moved away from being part of that community or believing in God at all. But for these people that we spoke to, we really wanted to explore it from, and this is across all the series. We weren't talking to people who had left. You could always do a critical piece that was sort of taking apart the more difficult practices of really any faith community. But what we were intentionally trying to do with the series, which is, I think, something that sets our series apart, is why do people struggle with these difficult periods of our history, policies of our communities, issues that our community is facing, and yet stay? Why are they seeing it as a dynamic thing as part of their lives today and want to continue in that?
It reminds me so much of this microcosm of what happens here in America, and dependent on who is in office, who is in power, you can move forward or seemingly backwards. And the rights that have been achieved can also be taken away. And I think that is something that we've taken for granted in this country. But in this timeline, we really see that nothing is guaranteed, and certainly not forever. And
that's right.
And life is cyclical, it's ever changing, and yet we remain here because it's part of our identity, it's part of our culture, and we find ways to power through, to stand for what is right, so that ultimately we reach that place that we all have inside of our heads, that dream of unification, of community, and believe that that is something that we can get to.
I think that's a great connection to make between it, this idea of being an American, and how many compromises or negotiations do we make with that American identity, in spite of the injustices that we see all around us in our society. I think that's a very astute observation.
With that being said, what misconceptions about religion and democracy surfaced in your docuseries?
Yeah, well, what comes to mind, for example, is in our Muslim episode, this idea that Muslims are entirely an immigrant population, that they came here fairly recently, and therefore are somehow culturally at odds with Western society. This is something that we see a lot in the news or in pundits, that they make this claim that Islam is inherently oppositional to Western values. And yet we've had Muslims here building our country since before the country was founded. And when do we ever take the time to appreciate the fact that a significant number of Muslims were among the enslaved population of Africans that were brought here from primarily West Africa and were made to work to build the industry and cities and of our country that has made it a success. We don't know their names. We don't know their stories, except for a very few individuals, because a lot of them were suppressed. A lot of these stories were suppressed, and their names were erased from the history books. So I think that asking the question, why don't we actually think of Islam as a fundamentally American religion, is a question worth asking. We would not ever doubt that. In fact, lots of politicians hold up this mistaken idea that America is a Christian nation, fundamentally a Christian nation.
Right.
There's nothing in the founding documents that say that. This is something that frankly very fundamentalist extremists have adopted as a position. And when you've had Jews here since before the country was founded, when you've had Muslims here since the country was founded, when their philosophies and teachings and frankly hard work and labor of those individuals and communities have contributed to building America, how can we say that this is anything but a pluralistic country, or a country that aspires to pluralism as one of its ideals? And I think those in our society, and certainly our leadership, that espouse something that is anything close to a Christian nationalist ideology are really doing a disservice to the founding principles of our country and hamstringing the future success that we could be with the incredible diversity that we have as a country.
I think that says a lot about this notion of belonging and who belongs, and that's an excellent point, because here, in this community, we talked a lot about the invasion of the other, right? The Muslims, the people, they're coming. And so that is a huge misconception based on the information that you've just shared. What does belonging actually mean? When we talk about belonging in America today, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and one that doesn't necessarily have a pat and simple answer. When we visited with Jewish youth in New York and asked them a similar question, some of them voiced an opinion that integration and assimilation are something to be applauded and looked at as a great opportunity of being here in the United States. The fact that Jews have had such an outsized influence on culture because of their innovations and the successes that many Jews have had in the area of business or media or the arts, and a lot of that, something as simple as many Jewish songwriters wrote the classic Christmas songs that we enjoy around Christmas time. There's a certain irony to that. But why is that the case? It's because in a lot of cases they were made to work within these systems and were successful working within them. But at the same time, there was pushback from certain members of the group that said, I don't want to assimilate. I have certain practices like maintaining a kosher lifestyle, being Shomer Shabbos, which is to not work on from Friday evening through Saturday evening, things that are unfamiliar or unusual in mainstream American practice. Typically, we have, again, it's a Christian notion to have Sunday off instead of Saturday, for example. There's nothing odd about serving pork ribs at a barbecue, on Memorial Weekend, or 4th of July weekend or something. And yet, if you invited an Orthodox Jewish person to one of those celebrations, they might feel incredibly uncomfortable to do that, because they're being invited to something where they don't have the benefit of being able to maintain their practice and fully enjoy the experience of being there. So there was this perspective that assimilation is actually a threat to the Jewish way of life from some of those members. And interestingly, as I said before, this was a thought that was expressed also by the Sikh members of the community that we spoke to in California. That why if the United States is supposed to be this melting pot, is supposed to be, as others might see it, as a salad bowl where there are lots of different ingredients that are included in the wonderful mixture of cultures and identities that we have here. The question was asked by one of the participants: why am I supposed to change? Why do I need to conform my identity to fit some sort of norm? Why, if other groups are allowed to live full lives, am I the one that's supposed to let go of my practice? And I think it's a good question for each of us to ask as we move through the world and encounter people who have practices different from ours. What are we doing in our day-to-day lives that either welcome someone with a different practice or directly or implicitly ostracize them or marginalize who they are?
And what are the stories that we are telling ourselves? You just talked about many of the Christmas songs written by Jewish writers.
Right.
Also, many of the propaganda films from the 1940s, right, that really gave America its identity. What we thought of the war, what we thought of what it meant to be an American and Americanism. Many of those films and stories written by Jewish people that gave us a framework about America as they themselves were assimilating and the belief that they had in what it meant to be an American at that particular time. With
Yeah.
that being said, what role do filmmakers play in preserving democracy?
Well, filmmaking, as you said, is a s- is a storytelling medium, right? And a lot of the choices that we make are influenced by the stories that we hear, the stories that we grow up with, the stories that are repeated constantly in the news or in our media diet, right? I think if you look at the stories that are presented today, it's almost undeniable to say that that religion is at work in every single one of them. You know, look at every headline, whether it has to do with reproductive rights, whether it has to do with education, whether it has to do with war as a concept. All of these are motivated by different religious principles, and I think if we scratch the surface, even on the ones that don't explicitly talk about religion, we can see that there are religious ideologies that are at work in each of those subject areas. So I think being honest about that in our storytelling is really key. And as I said before, you know, our religious literacy as a country is pretty abysmal. I think if we asked people the question, as one professor who's leading in this field, Stephen Prothero, does, around what is the religious literacy, if we gave a short exam just on some of the basic practices and principles, you know, forget Islam or
Most people would fail.
Sikhi, they would fail at a teaching at an exam about their own religion. You know, forget
Absolutely.
about the ones that are minorities. So I think
Right.
we need more stories that help tell these stories, provide accurate information in order for us to have a more engaged and educated populace.
Jack, what conversations do you hope will happen after people watch your docuseries?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for asking that one. Actually, we're embarking right now on an impact campaign for our show. In addition to releasing it publicly so that it's available to people on YouTube, we're also planning to travel around to different universities and partner with different interfaith organizations to have screening events and dialogue events around some of the subject area of this series. We just had one here in DC, our first public preview of our Gullah Geechee episode, the one that we were talking about earlier, that focuses on South Carolina. And the feedback that we received from so many audience members was, I've never heard that term before. I don't know what Gullah Geechee is. I've never engaged with the stories of the uprising led by Denmark Vesey and Gullah Jack Pritchard, who were a pastor and a conjureman that really exemplified this idea of this mixed identity of Christian and Hoodoo practice down there in South Carolina. So the opportunities to learn about these different subject areas are immense, and we're seeing the fruits of that already. And I'm just really excited to bring it to different community groups and educational institutions around the country in the coming year, so that we can help people to better understand these stories. And so if anybody's listening to this and they want to bring Undivided with Simranjeet Singh to their school, to their community, they should just look us up at undividedproductions.com and drop us a line, and we can see about making something happen.
That actually gives me a great idea to also introduce it perhaps to sacred spaces,
Love
as
to.
you're traveling about around the Dallas area. And
Yeah.
again, perhaps that is a opportunity that can expand and grow from there. Well, it
Yeah, and
certainly has
Simran
been,
is a Texas native, so you've got
is that
that.
right?
Yeah, that's right. He grew up in San Antonio, so you've got
Ah,
the
okay.
Texas roots in common.
Excellent. Well, it has really been a pleasure, and we're so excited. After this conversation, I'm even more excited to have you a part of the film festival, and I hope you've received your invitation, your invite to join us on a panel of filmmakers. I think either the final night or on that Tuesday after, and I think you would be
Wonderful.
a great contribution to the conversation.
I love it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Anything you want to leave with us before we cut out?
Yeah, just I'll reiterate, undividedproductions.com is our website for the show. Look for it coming out on YouTube in the coming month. It's not a random date. You know, we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States.
That's right.
And we are connecting this to help remind people of that First Amendment, the freedom of belief and conscience. And we want people to be thinking about these ideas as we make the celebration of our country's anniversary, and continue that into the future as we're thinking about these at this particularly precarious time in our country's democracy.
Everyone is doing what they can to join in, be a part of the fight for democracy, standing up, and I love it. And it's been really great to have you here. One of the things I appreciate most about Undivided is that it does remind us democracy is not simply about agreement.
Right.
It's about recognition that many different people, cultures, religions, histories, and experiences are woven into the fabric of this country. Even
That's
when
right.
those stories have been overlooked or minimized or forgotten. So perhaps the future of democracy depends not on becoming identical, but on learning how to remain connected while honoring our complexity. So thank you, Jack Gordon, for joining us today and for helping bring these stories to light. And thank you all for listening. I'm Addison Witt, and this has been Rise, a Defense of Democracy podcast. Keep asking questions, keep listening deeply, and keep standing up for what matters. Rise. We'll see you next time.
Let me introduce you to an organization called Defense of Democracy. We're a New York-based nonprofit with chapters across the United States. Our mission is to empower pro-democracy movements at a local level with the goal of protecting the Constitution and other foundational American documents. We have a coalition of like-minded organizations, including faith leaders, veterans, and students, and we work to promote democracy, stand up for inclusivity, and fight censorship and book bans in our libraries and education system. Well, for just $5 a month, about the price of one coffee-type beverage, you can support Defense of Democracy's mission, and you can make a difference in your local community and really in the entire nation. That's just $5 a month. I'm going to say that again. Not a day, not a week, $5 a month. One day out of 30, you can brew your coffee at home and stand up for the America that you know and love. So scan this QR code or visit defenseofdemocracy.org today. Put on a pot of coffee. We got work to do.